So, welcome everyone to the third panel. We're grateful for having you here. Welcome Marta, Jessica, Goyo. Thank you so much for coming to Haus der Kunst. First of all, I would like to introduce you to the participants of the third panel. Goyo Montero, ballet director and chief choreographer at Staatstheater Nürnberg. Goyo Montero first trained with Carmen Roche and then at the Royal Conservatory of Professional Dance in Madrid and at the School of Cuban National Ballet. Goyo Montero was first soloist at the Deutsche Oper Berlin and soloist at the Leipzig Opera, the Wiesbaden State Theatre, and the Royal Ballet of Flanders. As choreographer, he has created, among others, works for Les Ballets de Monte Carlo, Royal Ballet London, Birmingham Royal Ballet, State Ballet, Modern Dance Turkey, Company Gregor, Seifert Ballet Carmen Roche, National Ballet of Cuba. Goyo Montero has been director and chief choreographer of Staatstheater Nürnberg Ballet since 2008-2009. Since then, his choreographies for the Nuremberg State Theatre Ballet have included 24 world premieres. Goyo Montero has been honored with numerous awards, including the Bavarian Culture Prize, the German Dance Prize, and Pro Merites from the Bavarian State Minister for Science and Arts. Welcome, Jessica. You're a French-born and Berlin-based electronic musician and sound artist. You create situations where the sound acts as a transformative element for the space and the audience. Your first LP, Multi-Vocal, was released in 2019 by Important Records, stemming out of a project for a sleeping event at Ars Electronica, curated by Shuli Chang and Matthew Fuller. Since then, your work has been extensively presented in festivals, venues, contemporary art spaces, and museums across the world, such as Hamburger Bahnhof, Rainer Sophia, Canal Pompidou Art Basel, Villa Massimo, CTM Festival, Café Otto, Gedächtniskessel, and many more. You were one of the composers chosen as collaborators by Natasha Sada-Hagian for her installation Ankerzentrum at the German Pavilion of the Venice Biennial in 2019. You were one of the fellows in residence for Villa Romana 2023 in Florence and received one of the 2 ZKM Gigahertz Productions prizes the same year. You're a fellow of the Berlin Artistic Research Program 24-25. Marta Dziwanska is curator at Canal Centre Pompidou in Brussels. Between 2019 and 23, she was curator of collection at Kunstmuseum Bern in Switzerland, and between 2007 and 2018, curator and head of research at the Museum of Modern Art in Warsaw. In 2017, you were curatorial advisor for Documenta 14 in Athens and Kassel. You created and co-created several exhibition projects, so the other transatlantic, kinetic, and op art in Eastern Europe and Latin America at the Museum of Modern Art in Warsaw, and also beautiful exhibition with Alina Shapatnikov, Human Landscapes 2017 at the Hepworth Wakefield, and others. You're editor and co-editor of, among others, several publications. So, since Rebecca Horn's work interweaves a wide variety of media, and we're fortunate to have such important artistic voices here today, as those of Jessica and Goyo, as well as Marta, who has always been concerned with the power of literature and performance, since Rebecca Horn's work interweaves, all this variety of media. So I would be interested in how you perceive the work, what historically significant impulses you see in it, what inspires you, and how you reflect on her practice and your practice with regard to dance and music history, as well as literature. As we have 2 presentations with PowerPoint, I would love to start, and maybe my presentation can also serve as a base for a broader talk, a broader discussion. The findings are, so Here you can see the title of my short presentation, The Transformative, the Mystical, the Metaphysical in Rebecca Horn's work. Rebecca Horn plays with fiction, reality, and imagination, reached another high point with her participation in the Tokyo Video Symposium in 1978. The artist used the scene from the feathered prison fan, in which the ballerina balances an egg on her head, for an experimental contribution. It seems remarkable that her multimedia practice attracted international attention early on, and that she was invited to the event alongside the video pioneer Nam June Paik, among others. So her film sequence is decoupled, and the dancers perform live in the space, which is simultaneously transmitted to several television monitors arranged in a circle with different details and perspectives from different cameras, while a projection of the scene from the film can be seen in the background. Horn uses the closed circuit method, that is, audiovisual feedback between the recording and the playback system. She juxtaposed the performer with her own image. Once again, she emphasizes the synchronicity of action, image, and perception in a remarkable technical gesture. Yet at the same time, a disparate segmented perception arises due to the differently filmed shots and views of the scene. The living encounters its media image. So not only does it appear to be a filmic control of movement, it also creates the mystical concept of a virtual body. Elsewhere, Horn states, I'm concerned with the conditio humana, that is, with human existence, with its conditions and the desire to reach beyond them into an outside, into a metaphysical realm, if you will. With this contribution, she demonstrates a cycle of materialization and dematerialization. The previously extensive visual material in her archive on the early performances provides exciting information on the editing processes. It proves that to what extent Rebecca Horn choreographically staged the objects, body extensions, with the early videos of the performances 1, 2, but also the Berlin exercises. And here you can see the movable shoulder extensions and the unicorn photo prints of it. They show all stages from the rehearsals with the body extensions to the processional as an independent aesthetic experience from a wide variety of perspectives. Horn uses photography as a material that emerges from the movement and can be read historically, but also with a view to the future. In this way, a mobilization of the observation of unfinished bodily transformations can be traced, which at the same time become part of the body's own visual memory. The image archive is thus a valuable repository of ephemeral phenomena in which seeing and contemplating are documented as active actions. Horn uses the extensions to show how the energy of our bodies is connected to surrounding space. Here you can see the main space of the current exhibition and another early performance called Head Balance from 1972. The newly, so here a kinetic shift into the interior takes place as a leitmotif of all of Rebecca Horn's subsequent work. Could this be an omen for hybrid beings, biological organisms and machine, that is, for the prototypization of the world? So in 1976, a decade after Horn's early drawings, Ihab Hassan gave the keynote lecture Prometheus as Performer toward a post-humanist culture at the International Symposium on Postmodern Performance at the Center of 20th Century Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. This early mention of the term posthumanism marks the beginning of various debates in the 1970s about cyber culture and the construction of subjectivity. In Hassan's words, we perform and we are performed. Horn uses the idea of incorporation and has been creating symbols of technical and physical networking with her mechanical sculptures since the late 1970s and 80s. This approach of potential connections between living beings and machines promotes an awareness of multilinearity and networks as opposed to ideas of hierarchy and linearity. In her work, modes of perception and action seem to be metaphorically intertwined with contemporary technologies. For example, the monumental aluminium peacock machine from 1982. In this work, a frightening technoid incorporation takes place. It was during this period that Horn discovered film as an experimental medium. Her studio in New York converted into a ballet studio. She lived alternately in New York and Berlin for over a decade, starting in 1972, served as the film set for the Eintänze. Fantastic scenes take place. So like the exercises of the young dancers, you can see it here, who connected to each other by strings submit a mechanic control of their movements. Here, the person is no longer at one with their body, a programmatic symbol. The desire for absolute synchronicity is reminiscent of the leveling of human and machine. Horn uses the symbolic content of dance movements as medium and catalyst for her choreographic fictions. For Rebecca Horn, standstill goes hand in hand with movement. She is fascinated by contrasts and contradictions. Horn uses her studio as setting and like a cocoon in which temporal levels are suspended. In Rebecca Horn's work, film is an important resource and a powerful moment for working with choreography. So the dancers in the film represent a preliminary stage to the later movement machines. Like industrial processes, Horn's choreography breaks down work and exercise sequences into individual elements. Through the rhythmic repetition of moving sculptures, she creates symbolic figures as in dance practice. The Eintänze can be read as a self-portrait and acknowledgement of her own multifaceted artistic practice. The performance may also recall theater as a multi-medium and simulation of reality, experimenting with scenography, costume light, and physical action. The props are also particularly interesting. I would like to briefly draw a bow from a prop from the film and her studio in New York. It's documented in a photograph that Rebecca Horn took herself, a large mirror. It's a reminiscence of the mirrors used in dance studios. She later developed this important element into one of her first expansive installations called Ballet of the Woodpeckers in 1988. When you enter the room with its mirrors facing each other on several walls and hear the sound of the hammers banging on them, you're experiencing yourself moving in infinite reflections, and disharmonious sound lead to absolute disorientation of ourselves and our senses. Again, Rebecca Horn creates virtual experience through a multitude of spatial perspectives. In the early 1990s, Rebecca Horn began to create expansive installations, most of which were conceived in dialogue with the surrounding architecture. The audience is now invited to experience space of light, sound, rhythm, as well as their disorder. Her works question the nature of our bodies, and the appeal to the viewer's perception is calculated. Horn dissects and restages music in the same way that she uses dance and choreography. This deconstruction becomes constructive, as in the rebellious tones and rhythms of Concert for Anarchy. In retrospect, the New York exhibition, curated by Germano Celand and Nancy Spector in 1993, seems to have been an important impulse for the dimensions in which Rebecca Horn subsequently created her works. Starting from the body, continuing on through movement to the surrounding space and the appropriation of architecture. Nancy Spector reported on how Rebecca Horn's work, Paradiso, connected to the architecture with the breast-shaped funnels attached to the ceiling of the Guggenheim Museum, designed by Frank Lloyd Wright, from which milky liquid dripped into the pool on the floor belonging to the building. Horn took the architecture and vision of the museum to create a symbiotic living unity, as we heard also today before, with the spiritual contact of the so-called third eye. For example, upon entering the room with the work Circle for Broken Landscape, the viewer is greeted by the sound of two Tibetan symbols in the work, Thimble Zen, which create a meditative and declarating atmosphere. So, alchemical, physical, and spatial hybrids become allegories in Horn's work, reflecting the relationship between species in a shared universe. Bodies float, sounds clash, threatening electrical sparks fly, lights dance, and motorized hybrid beings celebrate endless in continuous rhythms, like a circle of energy, like a circle of energy, like a circle of energy. Thank you. And I now would like to hand over to Goyo, and it would be amazing to hear how you experiencing the work of Rebecca Horn.
Thank you, Jana, and thank you for the invitation. I feel honored to be here. To be honest, I only got to know Rebecca's work to a greater extent at a relatively late stage. What surprised me most was how omnipresent her influence can actually be recognized in various genres and especially in our art form. Of course, this is mainly due to the fact that she integrates and addresses central aspects of dance in her works. The associations with her work that come to my mind just quickly are so numerous and also extend to the stage, lighting, and costume design of famous dance pieces, like, for example, Crystal Pite's last works, Atlas, Angel Atlas, or Seasons Canon, and the light designs from Tom Visser. Is a designer from Netherlands Dance Theater, and his light designs are totally inspired by Cinema Verité. This work where she projects she projects the water reflections on a screen. Also, of course, in Sidi Larbi Cherkaoui work, there is all this architectonic and body sculptures that are also very much present on Rebecca Horn's work. And her work, I think, influenced cinema also. Look at Alfred Hitchcock or Orson Welles, or especially is even in pop culture on Tim Burton's Edward Scissorhands, you know. So I think she's all over the place, you know. And in very general terms, behind the lightness that many of her works radiate, just as you would expect from the art of dance, there is always the highest level of energy, concentration, discipline, and craftsmanship, which belongs very much to my art form, dance, which is highly connected to spirituality and art, but demands a great amount of repetition and craftsmanship. So it's a mixture of both, you know, something very spiritual and something very grounded. As a choreographer, I find the concept of body extensions, as she does in her famous works such as Unicorn, which runs through her entire work, particularly exciting and interesting. Her performances with prosthesis, in which she explores the limits of the human body, are of particular depth for me, especially if you know Rebecca's biographical background. All these actions which celebrate walking upright, balancing, or opening wings are choreographies of concealment and revelation at the same time. Her understanding of space, the division of space, and above all, the importance of the space in between, and how she understands how to create magnetic fields is very inspiring for anyone who works with a spatial concept. When you look, for example, at what Jana showed here in head balance, is this person holding this huge piece of material, and it's not only affecting her balance but also affecting the background and what is above or underneath, you know. So it goes beyond the interaction of the person that is holding this thing, but also the interaction with the person that observed that and what happens above or under this piece that delimitates the space. Lastly, many of Rebecca's works are based on psychological interaction, touching on questions of manipulation, such as what happens when a collective moves a person, which naturally gives her work a political dimension. Feather instrument, head extensions, all of them, they interact with a couple of persons, sometimes four, interaging with the person that is carrying this body extension, which has also a very much a political implication to it. A great inspiration for me as a creative person who always wants to think in a cross-disciplinary way is, of course, the multifaceted nature of her performative means that Rebecca has used in her cosmos from early on. It ranges from performances in which body instruments are used to feature films, drawings, poems, and kinetic sculptures to installations. As she was so intensively connected with dance in her own biography, I recognize in all her works that for Rebecca, body perception always also means spatial perception. Zum Beispiel, or as example, body harp, sensuality and synesthesia, eyes that touches, characterize Rebecca's work in particular for me. In this respect, I think that Rebecca's performances and installations, such as Feather Fingers, Pencil Mask, and many more, can be appropriately understood as choreographies. For example, the Kookaboo Mask. This impression is also reinforced by their use of sound. Think on the bursting piano or Concert for Anarchy. In another parallel, dance is always defined by the rhythm of movement and sound. What fascinates me most as a choreographer is how Rebecca interprets the dualism of man and machine, which was addressed in the symposium before. Rebecca is practically a pioneer in the field of robotics, and I think she opened the gate to many questions about organic robotics and things that have to do with science fiction, you know. So Rebecca's focus is not on the machine itself, but on the movement that bring the objects to life. She composes different types of movement and rhythm and also takes into account the accompanying sounds, allowing the objects to relate to each other as well as to the viewer. And I'm particularly impressed by the precision with which she staged her works, her precise view of the materials, her sense of timing, and her perception of bodies in space. Viewing her works inevitably sensitize the audience to their own bodies, something that every choreographer wants. The fact that Rebecca's work is also multi-layered and wide-ranging, and yet so little oriented towards trends, is unique. Her works often play with the aspect of danger and endangerment, thus involving the viewer, and one has to interact and respond directly to the work, cannot just observe. Get involved with it. Her work demands implication. In this way, the artist has succeeded in creating her own world, her own unmistakable iconography, aesthetics, and mythology. For example, unicorn, movable shoulder stations, arm stations, Kookaboo mask, then it becomes, unique and immortal.
Thank you so much, Goyo. So we would also like to learn more about your own practice and how do you approach a topic, how does your research work, and what inspires you, how do you conceptualize and then implement it with your company. And I know you brought pieces on stage like Steppenwolf recently. You were inspired by literature, obviously by Hermann Hesse's piece. So maybe you can give us some insights, and then we can reconnect that also again to Rebecca's practice.
Thank you. I like to think about choreography as a total work of art, meaning that most of the times I think what is most important is the research that you do before you come to the studio and work with the dancers, and how you involve the dancers to get to know all the material that you are involved with, so they also become part of the creation and the creative process. What inspires me a lot is basically the movement on space, set design also moving as part of the human body, and light design also part of the storytelling. So we don't see nothing, nothing becomes superficial, but everything is part of the main issue, which is transferring ideas and making the public being part of it. In special with Steppenwolf, we try to go out of the box, and I was mainly inspired by the work of Joseph Beuys. That's for me is a bit of a Steppenwolf himself, you know, and especially about the texture, aesthetics, and feel to it, you know, somehow creating our own imaginary world around it. Also, as Rebecca was amazed by video and cinema and in part of her work, I was also trying to use video as a main tool in the piece in order to interact with the audience, combining ideas of having recorded images and also live images to make the audience a bit lose the control of what is happening here and what is being recorded, and manipulating them in order to also have dancers among them as part of the audience, to make them realize that they were part of the piece in itself, like a bit what happens with Harry Haller when he's part of this magic theatre, and he becomes basically a part on his own piece, on his own story, you know. So I'm always trying to picture myself as part of the audience and trying um, to be amazed by it, you know, not just as a spectator that just sits and comfortably watch something, but someone that becomes part of the piece and is manipulated and feels sometimes appalled by it or moved by it. I think it's our duty as choreographers, as artists, to present questions more than answers.
I have two questions regarding what you said. First of all, you described how you try to interact with the audience and with kind of live images, and you brought up the term of manipulating. What other practices do you use for this interactive moment with the audience?
Well, I mean, I mainly try to picture myself as part of them, and I try to go and try to make something that makes audience come back to it. I think when we love a piece of work, we like to come always back, like when we come back to this exhibition, or we read over and over a book, or we watch over and over a movie. I think there's different layers that you can put in, like different riddles, or you can create a maze or a kind of like labyrinth, so that people can find different ways into it depending on how they come to watch the performance. I think the multi-layered work is something that fascinates me, and I try to also leave the little eggs for the audience to find them if they look deeper enough into it. I try also to make my dancers being part of it, not only as an instrument, but also as an active creator, and make the audience find their connection to them directly, not necessarily through me, you know.
Yeah. You said that the dances become a part of your pieces, and I would like to ask you quite personal question. So, regarding your own education, you were with Carmen Roche, and you were at the Royal Conservatory, and attended also the Cuban National Ballet. How did you perceive your education? How was it for you?
Well, I think I was trained as a classical dancer, and therefore there is a huge amount of discipline and work and physical demands to it. But we were basically trained also as an artist. You know, a dancer is a combination of both. We are athletes, so we need to train our bodies, but also our minds. So as I come from a family of choreographers and artists, I try to also. I was influenced by many different art forms, by painting, by music, and by composition from a very early age. So then I found my way out of just the classical canon and went into contemporary art and contemporary dance by interacting with choreographers such as Jerry Killian or Hans van Manen or William Forsythe, and I understood dance as a Gesamtkunstwerk, you know, and then all the doors are open. Basically, you can be free and become something that doesn't have so much of a restriction. And I think like Rebecca, dancers we go through a lot of pain, physical pain, in order to mold our bodies, you know. And then after that, we become free somehow through all this and a huge amount of disciplinary work, which can be understood also as little torture, you know. So, but through all this pain, we free ourselves, you know, and somehow we become beings of light and spiritual beings, let's say, you know. So, and yeah, I try to stay open as a choreographer and also discover new means and new worlds and try to experiment. I think is our duty not to stay in our zone of comfort, but go out of that. And we owe that to our art.
So, another question: how was the body and the psyche of dancers addressed and seen in dance practice in the past, and what has changed? And how
I mean,
would you describe it nowadays?
we in my world we used to be told what to do and we were told that that was the way to do things and that that was the right way because so many people before did it that way and we have to follow this tradition, you know. I think nowadays, thanks God, the artists are addressed and are informed about things and about why we are doing things, and I try to do that myself as a choreographer, as a creator, as a teacher, let's say, but try to bring my dancers into my own world and explaining why I do things. I think they do become part of the work and they feel much more involved and they don't feel part of a machinery, you know, which we were when we were in my young age, you know. I think dance is evolved that way, and I think it's become something much more interactive, free, and organic, you know. So it's much more natural. I think we get the same results with much less pain and with much more involvement from the artist or the student, you know. So thanks God, there is an evolution there, like there is in also education or in creation. And I think it's our duty to keep experimenting and discovering the new fields, so we don't try to teach our pupils the same way that we were taught, you know.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
So we're looking forward to a beautiful quadraphonic performance which you will give tonight. And you arrived yesterday here. You spent quite a while in the exhibition, and I'm wondering how you experience it. Maybe you can share your thoughts with us.
Yeah, first of all, thank you for the invitation. I feel really touched to be able to be in discussion with this work, also because she passed recently, and this is this big retrospective of her work. I think, especially in the case also of a female artist, which is important for what she does. I think the first time I encountered her work, I used to study art history. I know there's a lot of art historians today. And most of what we learned was in France. I was mostly white male from Western Europe and US. And she was one of the few female artists that were mentioned at the time. It was the first time I heard about what she does, which made me really curious. So about me, I'm not only a sound person, but what I do is involve quite a lot of technology, digital technology. So I think it really tainted my outlook on the exhibition, or how I experienced it. Because of course, I feel like we've had this talk on the the cyborg, etc. But we don't really talk too much on the scientific aspects of what she does. I feel like this was really present. You can really see her as a machine builder. And I find it interesting because from this feminist perspective, for example, this is more of usually seen as a male figure. And of course, someone touched on the subject that she was working with some people, and I think you mentioned she worked with two engineers, but this is a reality. Not many people realize that many artists that work on big scales, actually, they don't always do their own work. There's always a collaboration. It's not just her. And one association that I had in terms of reference in Europe was, for example, Da Vinci. I feel like, especially with the feather, etc., the act of flying. I mean, for me, I saw it directly, and I felt like she could fit also in this kind of history. And this kind of history of building mechanical devices, not only something from Europe or from the industrial times in Europe. It goes way back before. For example, there are some famous books. One is called, the Book of Knowledge of Ingenious Mechanical Device, that was made by someone that is called Al-Jazari, who was an inventor from Iraq. So this was made in 1206. And before this, around 700, there's a famous book that was made by three brothers from Iran. So in the story of automaton goes really, really back. And I feel like it's interesting to give another filiation to what she does and also to place women there. Because I think maybe in the way she presents what she does, she doesn't accentuate that too much, but it's definitely there. I think she just doesn't really, she's definitely not a technocrat or a techno-fetishist. And I think she has another outlook on what she does, but I think she has the same merit. And this is what I found really inspiring there, because I feel like she's really maybe trying to show like the expressive potential of technology and also self-reflective potential of it. I spent quite a lot of time at the entrance there is this butterfly. I spent a lot of time looking at it and I was like, wow, this is so lifelike. I can see this is a mechanism and there's only the movement is so expressive, but I almost see a real butterfly, and the only way I can know it's a butterfly is because there is the wings. So there's really something in terms of engineering there that is really beautiful and touching, and really different approach. She doesn't put on a show, technological show, I think. Yeah, and maybe I noticed that in terms of the curatorial decisions in the text were always ending with a question. Maybe it comes from you. I don't know if she was also like this, but I thought this was really interesting. I mean, it brings some kind of open-endedness to it and the possibility to project oneself in there. And I felt like the way she was experiencing with the limits of the body, reflecting on how you experience yourself in space. There was also one question concerning that was, what restricts our bodies and what expands our scope of action? So I felt like, because I was drawn toward this question both by the curatorial text but also by our work, I really started to hyper-focus on the museum or the institution and how it really restricts my body. And I started to notice how much I was surveilled in every room, how many times I've been asked to show my tickets. At some point, I had my coat, and no, I can't wear it like this. I need to put on myself. And this on top of the fact that, of course, I'm really interested by the site specificity of things, so I often reflect on the place, and this place has a really charged political history as well that has to do with the display of power, etc. So this was something I was really sensitive to, and I think it's because it's also something I reflect on in my practice sometimes. For example, the way you sit in a concert, you sit on chairs. I think when you sit on chairs like this, it incite you to act in a certain way. Maybe you're not so free to move. Also, I notice sometimes some people want to clap, but they don't dare. Maybe it's too disruptive, these kind of things. I feel like it's interesting to think about this because it doesn't need to be this way. It could be many other way, if you think about it. I think, by the way, this is what this installation in the middle is about, also like breaking this kind of mold. So it's also really interesting to have them in front of each other. Yeah, that's what I'm going to say now.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, it's yeah, exactly what you're saying. Also about the individual and the collective experiences. I'm interested to learn more how you're feeling about or how Rebecca Horn's approach to sound. I mean, what does it do to you? We went together to the Room with concert for Anneke yesterday. You experienced the Tower of the Nameless. How would you describe the importance of sound and music for Rebecca from your perspective?
I mean, in general, it seemed to be quite in the background. When it appears, it was always more multidisciplinary. I mean, maybe this piano work really references music even, tied to her experience as a ballet dancer. And there, I mean, this motif of I think I saw it was 2006, actually, it was later, not from the 70s. I think, I mean, it reminded me, there's a few work of from the 70s, what's her name? I have it here. Anna Lockwood, for example, burning a piano, etc. Or, I mean, it's a sort of tradition, ballet dancing, classical music, etc., which I'm not so part of. But I think there's a few artists that were trying to rebel against that. So it's the kind of association I had. But in general, it felt like the sound was more part of a general sensory experience of a work, Yeah.
And can you tell us how you came to work with sound and how you decided to work with it artistically?
I mean, I can tell this story in many different ways. A really boring one is that I started to study sound studies when I arrived in Berlin. I mean, it's true that before that, I didn't really have an artistic practice, even though for me, just educating my ear was a way to already have my practice, actually. I think just the act of listening and understanding through listening is really important in the practice itself afterward. So let's say that for now, this is going to be the story. And I think also the fact of arriving in an environment that felt so free. So encountering a whole community of people that work with sounds and also that are open to newcomers. Also, I was quite young at the time and really inexperienced. And it felt like at that point in Berlin, there was really a lot of open spaces. You could really ask and say, okay, I've never done it, but if you're serious about it and you want to try, there's a possibility. And this is how I grew. I felt like I was in a really also, how to say, inspiring community where it was possible to have feedback to grow. This was also super interesting. Yeah.
And one more question. Which role plays the body or bodily perception in your artistic work? Can you describe that to us?
I mean, of course, I'm heavily focused on listening, even though actually through sounds, you can really activate other senses as well. It depends of how you're listening. People will react with their body, just dancing. Sometimes if the setting allow, even if it doesn't allow, sometimes they just do it, which is great. Maybe some people are more visual, so they might see color, they might see images, etc. And sometimes there are some kind of psychoacoustic effects also that cause your body in a certain way that you're not used to, certain frequencies that you're not used to hear. For example, if you listen to pop music, the frequency range might be really limited. And also, as I was saying, sometimes I think of I think I chose music or the concert as a medium because I felt this it was more possible to be accessible first, and also it's a practice that exists in most people life. Maybe it's not the case, but they don't necessarily go in contemporary art spaces, for example, so it feels less exclusive. So I'm really playing with this format of the concert as a multisensory experience in a way. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much, Marta.
I'm really happy to present this little presentation that I have as the last one because it's and happy also to follow you, Goya, and Jessica, because it's exactly about the question what these works actually do with us, and it's a little bit more hypothetical, I guess, but I somehow didn't dare to enter into the universe of Rebecca Horn that is so rich, and it was just too big for me in a way. So I allowed myself to look at her from a very specific perspective, and this morning, Lanka already reminded about the quote from Rebecca Horn about her choice of the drawing. And I will just remind that because I think it's incredibly important. So she said that we could not speak German. Germans were hated, she said. We had to learn French and English. We were always traveling somewhere else, speaking something else. But I had a Romanian governess who taught me how to draw. I did not have to draw in German or French or English. I could just draw. And I think that, you know, drawing is just it's just an example, and she could say, I could just install, I could just dance, I could just do other things, right? So it's really like a choice of a language that she will speak in. And when I was thinking about this language, I suddenly thought, and this is, you know, like the issue of transformation, of metamorphosis is so present in the whole exhibition, and the references to, you know, to the writers and especially to Kafka are so strong that I just thought about Kafka more specifically. And as you remember, he was born in Prague, and this is where he spent the most of his very short life. And the thing is that he came from a Jewish family and counted among the roughly 7% of German-speaking people, Pragians, at the time when today's Czech Republic was still part of Austria-Hungary. And for me, it's very important because being a part of, you know, of roughly 7% of German-speaking Pragians is a choice, because he was speaking perfect Czech, but he was saying that this is the language of his emotions, and he wants to write his literature in German. So, like I was thinking that, you know, Rebecca Horn, by choosing drawing and the other ways of expressing herself, did something parallel to what Kafka did by choosing German. And, you know, like I'm being very aware that it's extremely hypothetical what I'm saying, but maybe you will find it of interest. So, as you you know, in the catalog and Rebecca Horn herself, very often the title of the Metamorphosis is returning. And but I started to think about parables and paradoxes that Kafka was working on the entire life, and these are the, you know, like the small micro worlds that he's creating, very short texts that are extremely interesting. And I really like, this is something that, you know, like every time you are reading them, it's like the whole universe that it pops up, and they are really like full of ambiguity and messiness, rippling from ungraspable content in a way. So it's really like a way for him to play with the language, but play with his own unsettlement. And I would like to read you one of the parables, and you can have it on the screen. It's a little bit long, but it's really nice. So I hope that you enjoy it. So, Kafka on parables. Many complain that the worlds of the wise are always merely parables and of no use in daily life, which is the only life we have. When the sage says, go over, he does not mean that we should cross to some actual place, which we could do anyhow in the labor were worth it. he means some fabulous yonder, something unknown to us, something too that he cannot designate more precisely and therefore cannot help us here in the very least. And these parables really set out to say merely that the incomprehensible is incomprehensible. And we know that already. But the curse we have to struggle with every day, that is a different matter. Concerning this, a man once said, "Why such reluctance? If you only followed the parables, you yourself would become parables, and with that rid of all your daily cares." Another said, "I bet that this is also a parable." The first said, "You have won." The second said, "But unfortunately, only in parable." The first said, "No, in reality, in parable, you have lost." And you know that Judith Butler is a big reader of Kafka, and I was trying to think about this Kafka's parable together with her a little bit, and to see how this resonates with the way how, I don't know if you, but I encountered the work of Rebecca Horn. So the question is actually if we can treat Kafka's parables as autonomous, and what is happening there is simply textual, and the text has a sort of autonomy, and there's no need to look outside of text to understand it. And this would be a way to keep parables away from theoretical, artistic, or even psychoanalytical or religious readings that are not based on close textual analytical readings. But it seems that parable is making it a little difficult for us to be complete textual formalists, because the parable, however poetic it may seem, is constantly pointing to the reality, and at the same time it is unclear whether this reality is inside the parable or outside the parable. So what is inside the text and what is outside the text is the problem for the parable. We might say that it is a problem that the parable is actually interrogating. If the parable is only a commentary on the language, its own language, we seem to be refusing quite a lot. Exactly, these allusions, history context, religious context, psychoanalytical one. We could say that the parable, and this is maybe the intention of Kafka, is contesting the ease in which we jump into linguistic formalism or contextualization. It's always difficult to state the beginning of the parable at the same time, as if they belonged to a longer receipt and were simply cut out of it. What reality is that? In what sense the reality? Where exactly is this reality? How does it affect the reader? And what does it mean to win or lose in parable? And what is the difference from losing and winning in reality? In a way, it's an issue of the space and where this other space belongs. The problem, of course, is that we never get out of the parable, within the parable, and yet the parable is constantly referring to the reality outside. The parable never actually functions as a complete transcendence of daily life, but it does give us a particular kind of textual space and time in which a meta-commentary on the problem of reality and parable becomes possible. And a very important thing that I think is happening also in the very beginning of this parable here is the first sentence and the command, "go over." But Kafka seems to be questioning both the textual and spatial presumptions we make about going, about the journey. And exactly when you both were, Goyo, you and Jessica, you were speaking about the spaces of, I was just thinking about this bigger question, where exactly we are when encountering the works of Rebecca Horn, and exactly I was thinking also about what these works are doing to the viewer, and about the in-betweenness, and that she constantly constantly questions, exactly like Kafka is showing here: machines, bodies, sculptures, props, animalistic movement, but at the same time, like what you said before about brokenness, about the tired machines and hesitating machines. It's all about bringing something that we don't actually know what we see. And I think that this is the most kinetic of all, because the artist is constantly leaving us, the viewers, unsettled. We actually don't know what we see, exactly like with a parable. We don't know in which space or not space we are. So I just thought that then in the context of of her playing between the mediums, between the reality and and the bodies and machines, I thought that it might be interesting to really think how much this polyvalence is being by itself extremely kinetic.
Thank you so much, Marta. You're giving us a better understanding how space and time works for Rebecca Horn. And I would recommend to all of you, there's one beautiful work in the exhibition called Nageldom for James Joyce. Each knife could stand for a feeling, a human being. The words, in the end, you have love and hate, and the motor. There are several circles in it, and it looks like a clock with so many levels. So maybe it's good to go there and pay the work a visit and reflecting what we were talking about here. We're a little running out of time, but I would have a last question for all of you. So does appealing the senses also allow us to be together in new ways? What would you say?
Can you repeat?
Yeah, I mean, to approach the senses with different artistic forms can us allow us to encounter new ways of togetherness? What would you say? With sound, with dance, with language?
Yeah, I mean, addressing the presence of the audience is already working with the space between a person and the artwork itself. And by this, the space between the viewer and another person next to him or her. So I think that whatever, like the kinetic works, or the works that are addressing different senses, are really like asking questions about how do we feel, how others feel. So it's always about seeing ourselves in the bigger scope of of others. So definitely yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think I always tend to link feeling with being more accessible in a way. I mean, there's a strong European tradition of being just in forward, somehow separating thinking and feeling. So this is what I do sometimes is about, which is how to convey knowledge also through feeling. So for example, I also use rhythm, because in a way rhythm, you can see this mathematical relationship. So there's a lot of things happening there that you feel. You don't necessarily need to have the prior knowledge to understand it. You understand it with your body. I think this is really a way of knowing. And it's also a way to be together, of course, through accessibility, maybe. And also because we experience this event together in a way. Yeah.
Well, I think we are all affected by each other. We create this work art basically to communicate with each other, and the person that looks at you makes you somehow transform your own expression, you know. So it's happening then, now. I think we look for this nowness, you know, this moment that is happening just now, and for nobody else, you know. And this is basically my art form that is happening live, you know. And therefore I think the work of art is nothing without the spectator, you know. And the spectator is also the work of art, like Joseph Beuys said, or like Marcel Duchamp did also. And I think we are all reflecting into that. We are always changing, always transforming because of the eye of the beholder, you know.
Thank you so much. I would say that this panel is also, or pays tribute to, to transdisciplinary artistic practice. I would like to skip the Q&A and ask Andrea Lissoni to be on stage, as well as Charlotte Matte and Hendrik Volkers for a closing discussion of 20 minutes. Thank you.